Hello, everyone. Just so that you know, we are recording this session. We will stop recording when we get to the questions at the end, just so that everyone feels comfortable asking questions without knowing that they're going to be recorded. So we stop the recording before the questions, but we will record the actual talk. So if you might want to keep your camera off if you don't want to be recorded in the little sidebar. But we're gonna get going. Oh, it's 10 o'clock now, so I suppose we should get going now. I'll just introduce myself. I'm Dr. Michelle St. Clair. I'm one of the EDLD founders. What I'm going to start off with, and I'll just introduce Annabel Burnley, my PhD student, who will be talking about her main project for her PhD. So Annabel, do you want to say hi?
Yeah, hi everyone. I'm Annabel
Oh,
Burnley.
I
Yeah,
still can't hear you, Annabel.
still can't hear me.
So hopefully we can sort that out. Otherwise, we might be in a bit of a
Yeah,
pickle today.
Anna Sarbatz says she can hear me. I think it might be you, Michelle.
I still can't hear you. Maybe, oh, do I have, oh, you know what? Annabel, can you talk now?
Yes, I think. Did you have your computer on?
Yeah, my computer was on mute, so apologies for that, everyone. That's technology for you. But I'm just going to start off with a quick slide to discuss what EDLD is, and I'll keep admitting people. People keep joining. So I'm going to quickly just discuss what EDLD is, and that's mainly for the parents in the room who might want to join EDLD itself. I'm just going to keep admitting people as they join in. So, the Engage with Developmental Language Disorder project is a project that is the first international database of individuals with DLD. And essentially, we are aiming to help people do better and more populated studies of DLD. So our aim is to really help researchers and also to help parents and individuals with DLD understand a bit more about the research. So what we do is we're targeting recruiting just parents of children with DLD as well as individuals with DLD who are over the age of 16 and can consent for themselves. And what we do is then we advertise, get researchers with DLD projects to email us and to tell us about the projects, to submit a few short questionnaires or short applications to our project. And then what we do is we tell everyone on our database in our monthly or quarterly research emails about the research projects that are out there that people can participate in. And then the parents and the adults of individuals with DLD can then take part in the research by contacting the researchers directly. So we only advertise ethically approved DLD research projects. We also sometimes ask our EDLD members opinions about our research ideas, and so forth. So I'm just, that's all I'm going to say about Engage with Developmental Language Disorder. If you are a parent of a child with DLD or an adult with DLD, that this might be something that you might want to look into. And I'll put a link in the chat to so that people know about that. But as we are, and I just want to, for people who are just joining now, we are recording the actual talk itself. So if you don't want to be recorded, you might want to turn your cameras off. I do if you want to be recorded and are happy with that, you can leave them on. But if you don't want to be recorded, then I would turn them off. And we will stop the recording at the question and answer so that everyone feels comfortable asking questions about the talk. But right now, I'm going to stop sharing my screen, and I'm basically going to hand over to Annabel, who will talk us through her project, which is called PLUTO, and it's a parent led intervention for children with DLD to help with social and emotional problems. Okay, I'm going to stop sharing and then hopefully Annabelle can take over and start sharing.
Yeah,
Over to you,
thank you,
Annabelle.
Michelle. Yeah, thanks, Michelle. I can see in the chat some people are having problems with audio. It seems like it might just be isolated to a couple of people, so I'm really sorry. I think it's Amy and Jean. I'm not sure what's going on. It sounds like everyone else can hear. But perhaps Michelle, if you can keep an eye on the chat and just if there are any technical difficulties, hopefully people can let you know. But it sounds like most people can still hear. Right. So to share my screen. Sorry, this is. Oh. Oh, Michelle, you need to enable me to share my screen.
Yeah, I will add you as a co-host or as a
Thanks.
host. Sorry, just give me a minute. I need to find you. You're at the top. Yes, you are. Can you do that now?
Yes, I can.
Great.
Okay, fantastic. So as Michelle just mentioned, yeah, I'll be speaking through PLUTO and introducing you all to it, which is an online parent-led psychosocial intervention for parents or carers of children with developmental language disorder. When I say psychosocial, I'm really talking about, I guess, the mixture of psychological and social difficulties that often children with DLD are understood to struggle with a little bit more than perhaps their typically developing peers. So just to outline what I'll be speaking through today, I'll give you a bit of an overview of the sort of recognised psychosocial difficulties that children with DLD are understood to sometimes experience. Then introduce the person-based approach to intervention development that we took in order to arrive at PLUTO. Give you an indication of the pilot study design and methodology. And here pilot is it's the first study of it's kind of like a pilot, I guess, of an episode of a series. It's just the first time we've been able to test its efficacy and feasibility, how much it works. The summary of our findings, and then I'll talk you through really briefly a couple of case studies of families that were involved in the trial. So that's Susan and Joni and Fionn, Evan and Reese. And just to confirm, all the names that I mentioned here are pseudonyms that were chosen alongside the parents themselves. Then I'll give a bit of an indication of the future directions of the project and perhaps give you some idea of how you can get involved. So it's, as I mentioned, it's quite well recognised that children with DLD experience a higher level of different psychosocial difficulties than their typically developing peers. Some studies that indicate this are depicted here on the screen, including 6 times the rates of anxiety disorders, twice the rate of depression, and an increased rate of somatic complaints than their typically developing peers. They've also been recognised to experience a higher level of externalising symptoms, and this includes an increase in comorbidity of ADHD diagnoses, so hyperactivity mentioned there, as well as more conduct behaviours. So there's a higher prevalence of children with DLD that end up perhaps in the juvenile detention centres and the sort of prison populations, and that's often to do with or thought to do with frustration and acting out in the moment rather than necessarily in any calculated deviance. They've also been recognised to be rated, well, to be far more socially withdrawn than their typically developing peers, and be rated as more unpopular by their peers than other peers. So that was hopefully a nice brief overview of what the sort of the studies and the literature says so far. But currently, regardless of how well acknowledged this is, there are no tailored psychosocial interventions available for children with DLD. And given that in many countries, the gold standard or the go-to psychosocial support is often referred to as talking therapies. When you have a difficulty with expressive or receptive communication, this obviously renders a lot of these as not very easy to engage with and quite inaccessible often for these children. So we really need a sort of tailored approach in order to help these kids and the parents navigate their development and help these developmental trajectories. So PLUTO didn't come out of nowhere. We used the person-based approach to intervention development, and this was across 3 years, 3 years of work that we've done here, involving a lot of really amazing key stakeholders and parents that have been involved from the beginning. So the first stage here, the planning stage, involved a systematic review of the literature of existing parent-led interventions for children with a broad range of neurodevelopmental disorders, so autism, ADHD, etc., to really understand what currently exists out there and how well is the data, how good is the data on how well they work. We also conducted qualitative interviews with parents of children with DLD as well as adults with DLD, which is really pivotal, I guess, in understanding the priorities and perspectives of the individuals themselves who perhaps experience these difficulties or don't, and what they feel like the intervention needs really are. Then we conducted a survey study online just to really, I guess, quantify these findings in a broader population and understand whether or not what was discussed in the interviews was really, I guess, isolated to those individuals, or whether it was broader. And this all helped us propose the guiding principles. So this is effectively the direction in which we would take the intervention and how we would start designing the content. Then the second stage was the optimization stage. So this involved a lot of consultation with what we call key stakeholders. So these were more parents of children with DLD, as well as healthcare providers who are very experienced in delivering interventions to children with DLD. So these included clinical psychologists, as well as speech and language therapists. And this really helped us refine the guiding principles and understand how appropriate the materials we were developing really were for the population. And finally, we get to the evaluation stage, which is the stage I'll be presenting today, which involved a pilot study that allowed us to gain both qualitative and quantitative feedback on how the parents found the intervention, how well we think it may have worked in terms of aiding the psychosocial skills of the children, as well as, I guess, the parents' well-being too. So to introduce PLUTO, it is a very multi-component intervention that we developed. And this is sort of a little overview of the 6 modules that it included. So the first module is really focused on what is DLD. And this really acknowledged the fact that a lot of parents, when at the point of diagnosis, often feel like they're left without very much information or guidance as to what DLD even is, let alone what it means for their child in the future. So we focused the first module really on getting everyone on the same page as to what is DLD, what might it mean for your child, and why might it mean that your child is more likely to experience any psychosocial difficulties. The second module then focused on emotion regulation of the child, so called your child's emotions. And we used a lot of non-verbal techniques here, things like feelings thermometers, which you can see on the screen there, as well as body maps, and just a lot of ways of, I guess, parents and children being able to communicate about emotions every day without the need for language so much, and sort of, I guess, navigate around the language barriers there that might be stopping the parent from understanding what's going on with the child, and help the child themselves understand what's going on inside them. Then module 3 built on that to then focus more on anxiety. So it's managing your child's anxiety. And again, a lot of visual techniques here. An example on the screen here is of storyboarding, where we really helped, I guess, break down what can end up being quite vicious cycles of outbursts and what parents often refer to as meltdowns, and really break it down to help both the child and the parent understand what's been going on in that situation, and how can we reassure the child of any worries of uncertainty or fears of the unknown that might be going on. That's quite common in these children. Module 4 then focused back on the parents, which had mixed initial responses. I know the parents weren't necessarily so focused on themselves always, so it was quite a gear shift for them to have to focus on themselves for 1 or 2 weeks. And this was really, again, acknowledging the amount of stress and the amount of pressure that's put on the parent in navigating and advocating for their child on a sort of daily basis. So this was really using techniques from CBT and acceptance and commitment therapy to help the parent really focus back on themselves a little bit and refocus on their own values and who they are outside of being a parent. Then back to the child, we did some self-esteem work with the children. Again, lots of visual techniques and the idea of building your child's confidence through focusing on what your child is brilliant at, rather than, you know, a lot of what can happen. And obviously in navigating these systems and trying to get support is a lot of focus on the child's difficulties. So focusing on what is special about your child with your child and things like that. And then finally, module 6 focused on what we call the outside world, which really was just looking to, I guess, non-verbal social communication and social interactions, but primarily looking to the future. And sort of hopefully doing this with a bit more excitement rather than trepidation. And one of the main things we used here is profiles from the adult qualitative interviews we did a couple of years prior, that really gave parents a perspective on what is possible as an adult with DLD, rather than them having to rely on a lot of, I guess, statistics out there, which can be quite worrying and damning. So that, I think, we found was incredibly helpful. So just to clarify again, like, all of this was delivered online. So this is just a snapshot of the online intervention and what parents saw when they were given their own personal login. So parents were navigating through each module as and when they had time. The idea was they were given 1 or 2 weeks or 1 to 2 weeks to complete each module. And this really, again, was acknowledging how hectic family life can be and illnesses that pop up, other critical incidents. And so we really wanted to give the families the best chance of engaging with as much of the content as possible. So this was all done parent-led, all online, and every week they would also have a call with me just to make sure that they understood how to navigate everything and that all the materials made sense. So we recruited 10 different families into the study. All of the families were required to be fluent in written and spoken English, but could come from anywhere in the world. All the children had to be between 6 and 11 years old and have a confirmed diagnosis of DLD. We recruited all these families through social media, so lots of parenting Facebook groups and DLD groups, as well as engage with DLD, which Michelle spoke through earlier. And I'm sure if you've just been joining recently, you can go back on the recording and find a little bit more out about that. And all of this recruitment was done in October to December last year, so in 2022. So now this chart is a little bit complicated, but I'll speak through it. This is effectively overviewing the quantitative design of our pilot trial. So what we used was an interrupted time series design, which effectively means we had a multiple baseline period. So parents completed weekly questionnaires before getting access to the intervention. That's the blue dots you can see there on the screen. Then the intervention was delivered between sort of 8 and 12 weeks, again, giving parents that flexibility, followed by a follow-up period where after access to the intervention, we again just kept monitoring the parents and the families just to see whether or not there was any change in symptoms then or any further, I guess, indication of effect or lack of. And as I mentioned, this data was collected on a weekly basis. So when I say data, what am I talking about? So we used the strengths and difficulties questionnaire primarily, so the SDQ. On a weekly basis, we used a short form of this. This is a parent report that covers emotional difficulties of the child, as well as pro-social skills and peer difficulties. We also had a short little emotion regulation scale for the parents to complete about their child, and an adult wellbeing scale, which helped indicate how the parent themselves were doing. So this covered things like anxiety and inward and outward irritability. Then we got the parents to sit down on a weekly basis and complete the state and trait anxiety inventory. So this, we really made a sort of visual version of what is typically used with typically developing children. And this focused on being able to capture how the child expresses how they feel themselves, which is not typically done, I think, with children so young and with language disorders, but we just really wanted to get the child's perspective. Then what we refer to as core measures basically was just completed at far less frequently. So twice before the intervention, before accessing PLUTO, and twice in the follow-up period. And this was just to get a bit more of a thorough indication of what was going on without fatiguing the parents on a weekly basis of too many questions and too many surveys. So what was included in these was the rest of the SDQ, so the full SDQ, which includes hyperactivity and conduct behaviours. And then we had some more child report scales. So James, the maths test, and Dylan is being teased are, again, more emotion awareness and anxiety regulation scales that have been made, particularly designed for children with autism. So what happens is the parent and the child have a story that they read through, and then the child has to respond according to how they think different characters might feel and how they might suggest those characters calm down or more appropriately behave. And then finally, there was a self-concept measure, which the child really gave the child an opportunity to reflect on how they see themselves. So it was a drag and drop box task, which just involved statements like, I am kind, and they would have to say, yes, this is me, or no, this is not me. In terms of the quantitative analysis, so we first did a visual analysis on a sort of case series basis. So what this means is we looked at every parent-child dyad or every family on their isolated basis. And this really allowed us to acknowledge the context of each family, particularly when we're monitoring families over effectively a 6-month period. There's going to be different changes that happen in that family. And so we really wanted to root the data in what was going on in that family, as well as give us a really deep understanding of the potential different effects of the different components of the intervention. So this is an example of Susan and Joni's emotional symptoms over this period, just to give you an idea of what this kind of visual analysis would look like. So what we could say here is that over the baseline period, there was a pretty stable but upward trajectory of Joni's emotional symptoms, followed by a really nice steady decrease of her emotional symptoms over the intervention. And then a bit of a plateau follow-up, but perhaps an increase again at the end of the follow-up period. So that gives us an indication perhaps there's some more intervention needed, or perhaps any long-term impacts that were felt, or any impacts that were felt by this family might not be so long-term. We also then did the clinical outcomes approach, which is a little bit complicated to explain, but yeah, if anyone's interested in that, please drop me a message afterwards, or obviously ask afterwards. Effectively, it's looking at the ratio of overlap of data points between the two key time periods, so the baseline and then the when the parents were exposed to the intervention. And this gives us an indication of improvement rates as well as effect sizes of the intervention. So in terms of the qualitative data collection, we collected in the moment feedback on feasibility and efficacy, which involved 15 minutes conversations with parents on a weekly basis whilst they were accessing the intervention. We also conducted semi-structured follow-up interviews with every parent, and this was at the very end of the trial. So after that follow-up period, which really just allowed us to get a bit more of a reflection from the parents and an overview of how they felt like it went when it wasn't so, in the moment. And this was all analysed using interpretive phenomenological analysis. And this, again, is just a qualitative analysis technique that, again, allows you to really root the findings in each individual's life context and what was going on with that family at the time. So in regards to the participant characteristics, so we had pretty even split of male and female children. So that's 6 boys there and 4 girls. A nice spread as well across the 6 to 11-year-old age range. Most of the children there, indicated by the number of 4, were 9 years old, but we did have representations across the board. There was a nice, again, representation of low and high income families, and this was stratified around the UK average. So it's just, when I say low, I'm just saying lower than average and higher than average, which we felt was particularly important to get that representation, seeing as a lot of families with DLD often are from lower income backgrounds who aren't typically represented in a lot of research. Most families did come from the UK, but we did have one family from America and one from Ireland. We also collected indications of parents' highest levels of education that they completed. And again, this is all stratified around the UK education system. So GCSEs there are the lowest level of education that you have to complete in the UK. That would be sort of around 16 years old. A levels are high school education, so 18, and then we've got undergraduate qualifications there and postgraduate. So what we can see, regardless of the otherwise representation above, is we've got a fairly well-educated group of parents here, which is definitely something that we will consider when looking to further develop the intervention and ensure it's really inclusive. Finally, and talking about inclusivity, all parents in the intervention were white. So again, something we are very keen to, I guess, acknowledge and improve on in further development to make sure we're not missing important minoritized groups, particularly when this is an intervention that's been developed in the Western world. Okay, so in terms of what at baseline, so at the beginning of the intervention, what the symptoms of the children were, we've got on the left-hand side there what the parents indicated as to how their children are doing, and then on the right side how the children reported themselves how they were doing. And what we've got here is a nice level of consensus. So about half of the children were indicated by parents and the children to be experiencing quite high levels of anxiety and internalizing symptoms. Whereas there were far fewer externalizing symptoms that were identified by parents. So there's only one there you can see at the top in that orange bar where a parent had indicated their child had high levels of externalizing symptoms. And just to clarify again, the difference between internalizing and externalizing. Internalizing is things like mood and anxiety, whereas externalizing is things like hyperactivity and conduct behaviors. though I would like to clarify, I guess in this case, it was very clear that that child, it was a hyperactivity more than anything else. In terms of how the parents were doing on entering the intervention, we've got, again, a high rate here of anxiety. So the majority of the parents when entering the intervention were either borderline for sort of clinical levels of anxiety or had anxiety, though very little outward and inward irritability there, which again is more of an externalizing frustration and things like that. So to summarize the results, 3 families out of the 8, well, firstly, 8 families of the whole 10 completed the intervention, which was really positive in terms of, I guess, the feasibility and the ability of parents to complete the intervention. The 2 families that dropped out were primarily due to time constraints, which again is something that we'll take forward in terms of flexing the intervention a little bit more. Of those 8, 3 families experienced significant positive changes in child emotional symptoms. Now, importantly, effect sizes were largest for anxiety and mood, whereas emotion regulation remained stable for most. And I'll touch back on this a little bit later with some graphs to indicate what that really means. 3 parents also experienced significant positive changes in wellbeing. And importantly, these weren't necessarily the same families that in which the child experienced the significant impact as well. And here the impact on adult wellbeing vary between households. And this was broadly because parents just had very different reasons for why their stress levels were high. For a lot of parents, it was really just to do with work, they explained. Whereas for others, they were still undergoing a lot of the diagnosis process in terms of trying to get their child assessed for ADHD or had been diagnosed with ADHD, which was causing a lot of stress in the household. So in terms of the qualitative indicators of impact, one of the main things that parents spoke about was the PLUTO's ability to improve the emotional communication between them and their child. And I think I have a quote there. Yes, I do. Joni here describes how it's been nice to talk to Joni's mum here, Susan, describes how it's been nice to talk to Joni almost for the first time about these sorts of feelings. That did surprise me a bit, her responsiveness to it. So Susan previously described being quite nervous about having any of these conversations with Joni, not really sure herself how to approach them and worried about that it might just cause further, I guess, distress in Joni. It also, there's another quote. Reese's parents also described how it's helped him express himself better. Instead of going from 0 to I want to kill you, we can go from 200 to 0 quite a lot better. So even though there was still a lot of, I guess, a lot of the outbursts, everyone in the family was able to calm everything down a little bit better because they were all able to understand a bit more what was going on. It also helped them manage stressful situations. So I've included here a little storyboard that was drawn by Isabella, which was just in her situation. She was getting very stressed when her father was going out one evening. And so what Isabella's mum did is sat down with her and broke down the situation because she understood through the intervention that probably it was just a lot of uncertainty and out of routine that was going on. So in the first picture, you have her and her dad together at home. It's all nice. And then her dad is leaving in the second one. And he's at the cinema there. He's not, I thought that might look a little bit like a cemetery. He's not a cemetery. He's at a cinema. Apparently that's what that was. In the third box there, that's her mum reading her a story, and she's in her favorite rainbow covers in her duvet, so she feels safe and she's happy, and her mum's going to be there to read to her, which her dad usually does. And then number 4, her dad is coming home in the car. 5, he will be there to give her a bedtime kiss, and 6, she can go to bed and it's all going to be okay. So really this gives an idea of how initially Isabella was feeling very, very stressed and upset that her dad was going out, but it enabled them to break it down and reassure her that it was all going to be okay in the end. Yes, and what it also did, I guess, in this respect too, is increase the child's self-awareness of perhaps some of the routines and the common triggers they were having on a daily basis. For one family, they described as soon as they get into the car after school, it's complete mayhem. And what this really helped them do by tracking things every day and speaking to their child in these different ways is for everyone to acknowledge that that is a common thing that happens. And so the child can be like, right, I've just got in the car. I'm probably going to get very emotional. So what are the breathing techniques or whatever I can do? And they all do them in the car together. Yes, the final thing that really was common across parents, was how it increased the parents' understandings of their child's difficulties. So you've got Ginny's mum here describing how it's not her being awkward, but it's often a reaction to the fact that she doesn't understand what's going on around her. Isabella's mum also described how it made me think we really need to be patient with that stuff, because she can't quite understand it herself. She can't work it out, whereas it's easy to be like, oh, come on, just get a grip. And this was definitely common amongst parents, and it wasn't one of our I guess core objectives going into the intervention of helping parents better manage their children, because to be honest, all the research suggests that parents are doing a good job. It's not the parents' fault that the children are experiencing difficulties, and we didn't want to put the emphasis on that. But parents themselves, it seems, have willingly been like, you know what, I get very frustrated with her, which is understandable, and this is allowing me to understand why she's being that way a little bit more and be a bit more patient with her, which was great. Of course, there's important barriers to engagement. So firstly, the child stage of development. So there were some concepts that we used that perhaps would be a bit more abstract and therefore hard for the children to properly get a grip with. So thoughts were one, bravery was another. Caden's mum here described how he definitely isn't grasping the idea of brave as yet, because he kept answering with things he was just scared of, such as the flies in the garden, the dark, or just what he's good at. And Caden was, one of the youngest children here, 6 years old. So that's definitely something that perhaps we'll think about specifying depending on age group and stage of development. They're also incredibly busy family schedules. As I mentioned, the two families that dropped out, it was due, or at least as they were happy to share with us, it was due to very hectic work routines, or one of the families there was a single mum with 5 kids. So a lot going on in the household and very little time to sit down with her own child and with one of her children and work through these exercises. Again, Caden's mum describes importantly did finish the intervention, which was great. But even she described how, I wish we had more time to devote to it, the PLUTO project. I'd say that was probably just our biggest struggle. I feel like whenever PLUTO started, work wasn't as crazy and life just wasn't as crazy. And then as time went on, it just got a little nuts here. And finally, and I think very importantly, the couple of families that did complete PLUTO but struggled a little bit more to get that depth of benefit from the exercises were those of children who had more externalizing difficulties. And this was only the case in a couple of families, but nonetheless, it's something that, again, is a big finding for us and naturally, it created almost more friction sometimes in the household, which is the last thing we wanted when a parent is having to manage a very hyperactive child to try and sit down with them after a long day at school and do more exercises with them. And yeah, one can imagine how that goes, and often that created a lot more frustration. So I'm going to really briefly touch on a couple of case studies here, just to give you an indication of another, echoing back the importance of, I guess, managing stressful situations. Again, naturally, when you track families over a 6-month period, incidents do happen, and we call these sort of critical events in the household. And in particular, Susan and Joni and Fionn, Evan and Reese's case, they felt that the PLUTO project really helped them manage these. So both the children in these families were 9 years old. Joni's female, Reese was male, both white British. Both low-income families. Fionn, Evan and Reese were a bilingual family, and both parents had completed sort of education to the age of 18 years old. So Susan and Joni, what you can see here, and this is actually the chart I showed you earlier, is a really steady and significant decrease in Joni's emotional symptoms from baseline to follow-up. But what's important here is there was a very stressful incident in week 10 where there was a death of 2 of their pets that had been around since Joni had been born. And effectively what this created in the family was a huge amount of stress on Susan, because Susan was so worried about telling Joni what happened and worried about what, I guess, questions that would induced, but also Susan's own stress levels, I guess, in terms of her grieving over these 2 pets. But what we can see here in this chart is that despite what happened, Joni's anxiety levels continued to go down. And again, this is what Susan described, was it really helped Susan give herself a bit more confidence in approaching the conversation with Joni, you know, having these frameworks of breaking things down and using visual techniques to explore how Joni felt after telling her that the pets had died. And it really helped keep everything very calm in the household. And she was quite surprised that actually Joni really didn't respond in the way that Susan worried she did. What was really important in this family, though, was that Susan, when entering the intervention, was one of the parents who was experiencing quite high levels of anxiety. And we were really pleased to see that this decreased during the intervention periods. Again, even despite the death of the two pets, what you can see Susan's anxiety levels increase a little bit there, but then return to normal. And we were really pleased to see that the intervention was able to allow her to spend some time looking at herself and really allowing herself to reintroduce some things into her weekly life that make herself feel better as well. Finally, Fionn, Evan and Reese. This was a family where you can see from the data points there was no sort of visual trend or significant trend like there had been with Susan and Joni in Reese's changes in emotional symptoms from baseline to follow-up. But the important thing here is that there were two critical incidences during this time period. So Reese received an ADHD diagnosis in week 10, and then there was a very significant death in the family in week 12. And of course, this prompted a lot of panic attacks and physical symptoms of anxiety within Reese. But what both Fionn and Evan described is, and I think I have a quote there that I've mentioned previously, is that the opening up of conversations in the family and the non-verbal ways of communicating through what happened and the complications of grief and the abstract natures of death really helped return Reese's anxiety levels back down to that sort of more moderate level you see there in week 14, much quicker than they feel like it ever would have done beforehand, which was really, really great to hear that contributed in a positive way. I mentioned before that there was a difference between the change in emotional symptoms to emotional regulation. And again, I'm going to use examples here from Susan, Joni, Fionn, Evan and Reese. So we've got the charts there that I've just shown you in the previous slides. So the emotional symptoms of Joni and Reese. And we can see there's a lot of variability on a week-to-week basis, a huge decrease, with Joni, and a real variability with Reese. Whereas in contrast, and I hope this comes across how different this is, when you look at the emotion regulation symptoms, same families, same data points, but an incredibly stable, non-fluctuating experience of emotion regulation across this sort of 6-month period. And again, both families experience these critical instances in week 10, and there seems to be very little change in the children's emotion regulation abilities during this time. So that's also a sort of, again, unintended but interesting potential finding for further research afterwards. Perhaps, anxiety and emotional symptoms manifest in a very different way to the regulation abilities of these children. So just to finish on future directions, so of course we need further intervention development work. A real priority for us is to engage with minoritized families, and also increase the feasibility amongst families of children with externalizing symptoms. Again, a priority is not to increase any stress levels in the household. And implementation work to really try and bridge the gap between speech and language therapists and clinical psychologists that, at least particularly in the UK, children seem to fall through the gap in the service provision. And then conduct a full randomized control trial to understand the impact of the intervention, PLUTO, across a larger sample, and compare the effects of the intervention with both active and waitlist controls. I think that's everything from me. I just wanted to acknowledge the amazing sort of support and collaboration from a number of different academics and clinicians who are shown on the slide there, including Michelle, who's obviously here today, as well as the parent consults who helped us not only develop the intervention, but all their feedback during the intervention. Hugely thankful to you all, and the Evelina London Centre speech and language therapists from St Guy's and Thomas, who also helped consult on the development of PLUTO. So thanks, everyone. I think that's everything. Shall I stop sharing the slide and we can have a look at...
Yeah, you can stop sharing. I have just launched a poll just to tell us a bit about who you are, where you are in the world, and just so that we have a bit of information about who actually attends these online events that we host. Right now, I'm just going to open it up to any questions. So first of all, I'm going to stop the recording. So do that.